Fast. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I hope you are staying warm and dry wherever you are this evening. If you didn't join us last week, my name is Courtney. I am the Cleveland County horticulture educator. I get to teach these awesome classes and help people in the Norman and Cleveland County area with all of their horticulture questions. And so I'm excited that you're here with us tonight. This is kind of an experiment we've been doing. This is the second of our spring garden series that we are doing over a webinar format, which I think has been really fun. We've been able to get some new people, and so I'm glad everyone's here this evening. Tonight's topic is soil. So we're going to get all up in the dirt and talk about all that wonderful, fantastic soil that we have beneath our feet when we're gardening. Real quick, if you haven't already, I sent out a pre-assessment. If you could just fill that out, that's just kind of helping us get some metrics for where we're starting. And then I will send a post-assessment tomorrow with the recording and a PDF of the PowerPoint so that you can see, if you can review it. And if you have any other questions that linger, I'm happy to answer those. So before we get started with tonight's topic, just a couple housekeeping things. If you could please keep your microphone muted throughout the webinar. We've got quite a few people on tonight, and so just want to avoid the background noise of dogs barking and things like that. So if you could keep your microphone muted, I'd appreciate it. I do have Judy, one of our Master Gardener volunteers, is helping me moderate this evening. So she's going to kind of help with the logistics of things. She's also going to be watching the chat for me. So if you do have questions, please post that in the chat so that we can get those answered as we're going through tonight's discussion. We are recording, so just got that started, and I sent out that pre-assessment. And then also just a slight little disclaimer that I am in Cleveland County, Oklahoma, in central Oklahoma. So if you do have questions from other regions of the state or other parts of the country, I will do my very best to answer those, but my experience and expertise is here in central Oklahoma. So getting started with soil. So we talked last week a lot about what plants need and what they need in order to survive, and we briefly touched on the fact that they need nutrients in some form, as well as water. So bring that back up. And of course, they need light and they need air and they need a conducive temperature. But where we're going to get those nutrients from is within the soil, as well as water. So those two key components that we need for our plants to be successful are coming from the soil. And so we don't want to ignore the soil. We want to appreciate it and take care of it in a way that we take care of our plants, essentially. So that is what this evening is about. So what is soil? So the quick kind of academic definition, it's the unconsolidated cover of the earth made up of mineral and organic components, water and air, and it is capable of supporting plant growth. And so while tonight's talk is named dishing dirt, I know some soil scientists who will tell you that dirt is a 4-letter word, and we are going to say soil because soil implies a living complex of organic matter and this lovely web of all these things working together that can support plant life. So as the definition mentioned, soil is made up of 4 things. Mineral, and that's going to include the sand, silt, and clay. But in between those particles, those mineral particles, we do have a pore space. And that pore space can either be filled up with air or water. And we typically want that pore space to be filled up with a even ratio of both. We don't want it to all be air, or our soils become dry and unable to promote healthy plants, but we also don't want it to be completely soaked and completely filled with water, because then the roots can suffocate and they're not able to respire and grow. So we also have the smallest part of our soil, which is one of really the most important, and we'll talk a lot about this later this evening, is the organic matter. And so that's any decomposed material within the soil. And it really acts as the muscle of the soil, really helps make that soil healthier, helps with plant growth. If you have problematic soils, say it's overly heavy in clay or maybe too sandy, adding in organic matter can be a great strategy to help with some of those problem soils. So as I mentioned with the minerals, those mineral particles, we have sand, that's a very, very large particle, all the way down to clay, which is a very small particle. And here in central Oklahoma, it seems like most of us have pretty heavy clay soils, can sometimes be a challenge to really grow in those. But we're also in this area, we do have a river, and if you're near that river, then you are on sand. And so we either really have one or the other where we're at. But to talk about soil quality and the different components of soil quality, we really focus on three things, and that's going to be the physical, the chemical, and the biological properties of the soil. So we'll go through these each in a little bit more depth. When we talk about the physical properties of soil, we can talk about the color of the soil. That's a lot of times determined by the history of the soil and how that soil was derived, or what the chemical composition of that soil is. And so that can be a part that plays into the physical property. We also can consider the structure of the soil. So how does that soil really begin to form? And we typically see that in a much lower part. We're not going to maybe necessarily see the structure in those top layers. So if I go back to this slide, you'll see those different horizons on the soil, that soil profile. And typically we're dealing really with that top two horizons, the O horizon, which is where there's a lot of heavy organic matter, and then the A horizon that supports a significant amount of plant roots. When we start to get into the B horizon and the C horizon, that's where we'll start to see the structure of soil, where it might be blocky or cloddy, and it has different structures to it. But we probably won't see that so much when we are gardening. What we will see though is the soil texture, and that's going to be the ratio of sand, silt, and clay that we have in our soil. And so what you have pictured here on this slide is the soil triangle, which is a very nifty tool to determine what type of soil you have based on the ratio of those three particles. And so the way it kind of works is if you are able to determine that you have 30% sand, 30% silt, and 40% clay, you could follow those points, and where they intersect is what type of soil you would have. And so in that case, if you had that, you'd be in between a clay and a clay loam if you had a 30% silt, 30% sand, and 40% clay. Now, a fun trick, if you're not sure what percentage of soil or what your soil texture is, what you can do, you can get a mason jar and fill that up with some of the soil from your garden. Fill that with water, and so it's kind of a water and a soil mixture, and then shake it up really, really good, and sit that out for about 24 hours, and those particles will actually begin to separate, and you can visually see that ratio when you're looking at that soil. So that's something that you could do. Now, with the different types of soil comes some pros and cons. And so with a sandier soil, you have much larger particles. So it's easier for that water to drain through that profile. So there's more space, it's easier for that water to move down. However, sandy soils tend to be less fertile. And that's because nutrients are exchanged on the surface area of those soil particles. And sandy soils have a smaller surface area overall. And so there's not as much, there aren't as many opportunities, I should say, for that nutrient exchange on those particles. Now, the opposite of that is a clay soil, which has a very small particle size, and so those pores are much smaller, and so it's very difficult for water to move through that profile. And if you have a heavy clay soil and you find yourself with a heavy amount of rain, you know that it takes a long time for that water to move through and infiltrate that soil. That clay soils will stay muddy for quite some time after we get a rain. Now that being said, they are much more fertile because of that higher level of surface area. So they're a bit smaller, they're a lot smaller, and we have more surface area to play with as far as nutrients. And so ideally, if we were to pick the soil that we were inheriting for our gardens, we want somewhere in the middle, so kind of so that we have a little bit of both. But that's not always what happens, right? So to visualize this just a little bit more, this could be a clay soil profile. The particles are very small, and it takes time. It takes time for that water to move through that. However, looking at the surface area, if we highlight that there in purple, we see that we have a lot of surface area and a lot of places for those nutrients to be exchanged. Now with a sandy soil, it's a much larger particle, so the water moves through more quickly, but a lot less purple. We don't have that same amount of surface area. Which brings me to just a quick little extra point. If you're trying to amend a clay soil, it is not a good idea to add sand to that clay soil. We may think, oh, it's a larger particle size, it'll open this clay up, but unless we are adding a significant amount of sand to that spot, what happens is the clay just clogs up the pores within that sand, and really water can't move through it at all, and we end up with something similar to concrete. So do not add sand to clay. Now, moving on to chemical properties, we have, of course, the nutrients, but we also have pH. And so that can be a measurement of how acidic or alkaline that our soils are. Now, typically, with most plants, they prefer a slightly acidic soil. And so I have kind of a range there between 6 and 7, but that's really sort of where they like to be, is in that slightly acidic range. There are a few plants that do prefer very acidic soils, so more of like a 4.5 and 5 range, and those are going to be things like blueberries, azaleas. They really require that lower pH to be happy. Now, through our office, we also do soil testing, and I look at a lot of soil tests from the area, and we tend to hang out more in the more alkaline, really like a 7.5, 7.8, sometimes inching into that 8 range with our soils. And that can be a challenge for our plants. Because pH really factors into how available the rest of the nutrients are within the soil. So looking at this graph here, this is a graph illustrating the availability of certain nutrients at certain pHs. And so you can see that maximizing the availability of those nutrients is really around that 6.5 to 7 range, is where we're going to get have the most amount of nutrients available. Whereas if we start to get into the higher and the lower range, the availability of those nutrients decreases. And so I'll highlight, this can a lot of times be a problem in if we start to see iron chlorosis, which is like a yellowing of plant leaves. We see this in certain trees, particularly pin oaks. We see that they're yellowing and we notice it's iron chlorosis, which is an iron deficiency. So the natural thing to think would be, oh, well, then I need to add iron to the soil. Well, if the pH is high, there may be plenty of iron in that soil, but the tree isn't able to take it up because the pH is too high. And so we need to turn our efforts to really lowering that pH rather than adding in more of something that tree is not even going to be able to pull up. And so that's why pH is so important. It's really the kind of the barrier of whether or not those plants are able to pull up certain nutrients. And so that's just kind of a range of where we want to see our pHs. Now, if you get a soil test back or you're able to determine your soil test pH and you know you need to change it, there are a couple things that you can do. If you find that soil is too acidic, you can use lime to raise that. But what we see oftentimes is that it's too high, and we can use an elemental sulfur product to be able to lower that. And so I don't see lime as low pHs that need to come up as often as I see pHs that need to come down. And so you can get an elemental sulfur product at the box stores or garden centers. You might also see it labeled as a soil acidifier. And so that's something to look into if you find you have too high of a pH. I'll pause real quick. Does anybody have any questions on that? And then I'm going to try and figure out how to get that red line off the screen. Any questions? Are there other ways to lower pH? Excellent question. So sulfur is the best recommended way to lower pH. Over time, or I should say the most reliable way to lower your pH. Using certain mulches like pine needles or pecan shells, that can do it over time, but it's a very slow process. And the reason you want to do sulfur is because it's a slow process. So the organisms within that soil, they will slowly begin to break that sulfur down into an acidic version of itself. And so that makes the acidity last a whole lot longer within the soil. So that's as opposed to like if you were to go out and pour like lemon juice on your soil, that would change the pH for maybe 5-10 seconds, and then the soil would begin to go back to what it tends to be. So soil with pH, it's kind of hard to change. It's not impossible, but it takes time. And so if you're adding in sulfur, you want to do that about a season or so before you plant, because it takes time for it to break down and release those ions into the soil and create a more acidic soil. Another question is, how does wood ash help? So wood ash will act like lime and brings the pH up, which it can also add in the, excuse me, sorry, I got distracted. Wood ash is also it's a good source of potassium, but it tends to raise the pH very high. And so in our areas where we have where we have that higher pH, where we tend to have higher pH, we want to be very cautious with using wood ash because it can bump that pH up pretty high pretty quickly. And then another question, is compost typically acidic or basic? I believe that depends on the source of where it's coming from, but I think it tends to be fairly neutral. But it might depend on exactly what type of compost you're using. Okay, I can't figure out how to get rid of that little red line, but I did turn annotating off, so hopefully that's the last little red line that shows up on the screen. Okay, so mentioned a couple nutrients already, so wood ash can add potassium, but there are lots of nutrients that we need these plants to be able to absorb and to pick up, that they need in order to be able to do the processes that they have in their plant life. And so there are 16 essential plant nutrients that are required for plant health, which includes carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And those in particular, those are not absorbed through the soil. Those are either absorbed through, or excuse me, those are not absorbed through the soil. So those come from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis and using water as well. But the other elements that exist within the soil include our macro elements: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so plants need those in a high quantity. And so when it comes to fertilizing and amending our soils, we're going to be adding those back in the most. Now, secondary and micro elements, they're also important, but they're not needed in the same volume as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And typically within most soils, those elements are going to be readily available in the amounts that plants need them. Unless you're growing something very specific like grapes or pecans, typically in a garden or a landscape, you're not going to need to add necessarily those extra, the secondary or the micro elements. But the macro elements do need to be added typically on a regular basis. So talking a little bit specifically about the macronutrients, nitrogen is required for that leafy green growth. And so if you start to notice your plants aren't growing as rapidly, or maybe they have a little bit of a yellow tinge to them, that could potentially be a nitrogen deficiency. Nitrogen is also very mobile within the soil, meaning that it's not going to stick around for very long. It tends to leach and move through that soil profile if it's not absorbed by the plant. And so we kind of have to tend to add nitrogen a bit more depending on what it is that we're growing. Phosphorus and potassium. Phosphorus is required for healthy flowers and roots, whereas potassium is really sort of an immune defense, allows that plant to be able to ward off pathogens and be less susceptible to environmental stresses. And so it's kind of that immune defense. Now, phosphorus and potassium, these will remain in the soil for long periods of time. They're immobile in the soil. And so when you add them, you don't necessarily have to continually add them over and over season after season like you might nitrogen. And so the analogy that we make is that nitrogen is like gasoline. So you have to put it in the car for the car to go from point A to B. Whereas phosphorus and potassium are more like oil. So you need to check them every once in a while, make sure the levels are good. And if you notice something is low, that's then when you would add that phosphorus or the potassium in. You don't need to add it in every time you gas up the car. If you put more oil into the car every time you gassed it up, I'm not a mechanic, but I don't think that would be very healthy for the car. And it's not very healthy for our soils if we add in phosphorus and potassium every single time. So we want to make sure we're not over applying those particular nutrients. Now, if you start to notice that certain nutrients are, or if you start to look at your plant, you think something's going on, a couple different ways to determine what that might be. If you see that it's kind of sort of yellow, like the veins are staying green, but in between the veins on the plant, it's beginning to yellow. You're not seeing very good growth. That could potentially be a nitrogen deficiency. If you start to notice that your plants are purple, kind of have a purple tint to them, or maybe they're not developing their fruit or their seeds very quickly, that could potentially be a phosphorus deficiency. And then if you start to notice that the tips, really sort of the tips, the margins around the plants are beginning to yellow, maybe you're seeing more diseases, or issues, very weak stems and slow growth, that could potentially be a potassium deficiency. Now, there is a way that we can take the guesswork out of it. And I alluded to this a little bit in our pre-assessment for today. So to take that guesswork out of it and to be able to really actually know what it is that we need to put into our soils, we can get a soil test. And so that can be done through the extension office. It's $10 for a routine test. And that can give you the exact amounts of what you need to be able to put in your soil. And that's great for a couple things, to really be strategic about it like that, because one, we're not over adding things to the soil. We're not putting extra nutrients into the soil, because if we're putting extra nutrients into the soil and the plant can't take up all that, it's eventually going to leach into our groundwater or run off with our storm water and cause environmental issues down the road. It's also a good thing to not over add things, because then you're not spending the money on fertilizer that you don't necessarily have to spend. So it's good for the environment and your pocketbook. So to take a soil sample, what you'll need, you want to go around the area that you're interested in. And so if that's your garden or your landscape or your lawn, kind of pick that area that you're interested in. And then you want to go around and get about a 6-inch or so core from that area. And so that's very easy to do if you have a soil probe that's pictured here in the back of the slide. You can check those out from the extension office. You just have to bring them back. It's a free service, just bring them back, please. But you want to do that. You want to go down and get about a 6-inch core from 15 to 20 random spots within your within the area that you're interested in. And then you want to put those into a clean bucket. You don't want it to be a bucket that you've mixed fertilizer or pesticides in or anything like that. Make sure it's a nice clean bucket. Mix that together. That kind of sort of averages out all those samples that you just took to get an overall average of what it is that you've got going on in that area. And so bring that to the extension office. Like I said, it's $10. We ship it off to Stillwater, where they'll run their equipment on it and run all the tests. We get the results back, and then I will help you with the recommendations. So I mentioned it's $10 for a routine test. That will get you pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so those really what you need if you're getting started and you just want a baseline of what you've got going on in your soil. You also can, there's also a couple of other tests. Organic matter gets you an actual percentage of the organic matter that you have in your soil. Salinity looks at the salt content of your soil, and so that can be sometimes an issue. So if you believe that's what's going on, we can look at that content. You can also get the secondary and the micronutrients added onto your soil test, as well as soil texture. So if you didn't want to do the fun home experiment in the jar where you shake up the soil and you want just someone to tell you some numbers, we do have a soil texture test. So if we are looking to improve soil quality, And we're looking to add in, particularly adding in some of the nutrients that we're missing, we can use fertilizer. And so if you're at the garden center and you're shopping for fertilizer, you're going to notice that there are 3 numbers on that fertilizer bag that represent the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the weight of that product. Now that goes for synthetic fertilizers, but it also goes for organic fertilizers as well. So if you're looking for something that was derived from a natural source to amend your soil and was not necessarily a man-made product, you can still use an exact approach with a soil test and the numbers on some of the organic type products and what they say are in the product that you're buying. This varies a little bit from brand to brand, but if you're looking for an organic amendment that's mostly nitrogen, blood meal or fish emulsion are good options. If you're looking for something to increase phosphorus, bone meal is going to be your best bet. And then if you're looking to add in some potassium, but don't necessarily want to use the wood ash, which may cause pH issues, you can use green sand, which I believe is a dehydrated algae product, or like a kelp seaweed. So these are derived from some ocean plants to be able to add back in that potassium. So if you have your soil test and you have the fertilizer that you plan to apply, there is a little bit of math to figure out what it is that you want, the amount that you want to then add to the area of your garden. So to do this math, what you want to do is you'll take the recommended quantity per area of the per unit area. And so that's going to come from your soil test. And so this is kind of an example here of a soil test, what you'll get. And so this one in particular says we need to add 0.7 pounds total nitrogen to that area. And then you're going to divide that number then by the percentage of the element in your fertilizer. And so that's going to come from your fertilizer bag. You multiply that by the square foot of your garden and you get how much you need to apply over that area so that you can meet that requirement or meet that amendment for those plants. So an example, if the soil test came back and said you need 2 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, you bought fertilizer that was had 20% nitrogen, multiplied that by 500 square feet, you'd end up with 5 pounds of fertilizer for that area. Now I'll let you in on a little hint. If this math scares you, if you do a soil test through our office, I will do this math for you so that you don't have to worry about it. So consider doing a soil test. So talking to also about organic matter. And so I mentioned earlier, organic matter, it's really sort of that muscle of the soil. Of course, the nutrients and the chemistry and those components of the soil are very important, but if we don't have organic matter, we start to lose the life of the soil. And so it's a very important part of soil that we shouldn't overlook. Particularly too, because it can increase drainage in heavy clay soils, as well as help with retaining moisture and nutrients in sandy soils. So it's really the key if you have problematic soils. It's also very important if you're trying to grow organically, because essentially what happens is there are all these wonderful magical microbes within the soil. And if you feed those microbes have a waste product, and essentially their waste product are the nutrients needed for the plants. And so you have to feed the microbes to feed your plants when you're growing in an organic setting. So that's kind of the way to look at it if you are using those organic products. So what is organic matter? We can break this up into 3 different categories. I like to call it the living, the dead, and the very dead. So we'll go through each of these individually. So starting with the living, this is really this biological property of soil. It's very, it's the life of the soil. And so that can be anything from very small organisms like bacteria, all the way up to very large organisms like moles. We may not always appreciate moles and gophers for their presence in our gardens, but in the grand scheme of things, they're nature's aerators of soil. And so this group is very, very important because of what I mentioned about how we need to feed them so that they can produce that waste, essentially, to be able to feed our plants. And so how it really works is that the living, they feed on the dead to release nutrients, and then they create humus. And so humus is the very dead. And so, like I said, this is really the biological property of the soil. It's it adds to that living component of soil, and that how once we have that in order, then we can have very healthy soils. And so if our physical and our chemical properties are in balance, that biological diversity will flourish. So if we're not over fertilizing and we're taking care of the soil, we will see all of those organisms begin to develop within our soils. I know sometimes I'll have people ask, well, can I just add earthworms to my soil? Will that break it up? With this, it's really more of a build it and they will come situation. If you put a bunch of earthworms out into a very compacted, heavy soil, they're not going to be happy. They're not going to make it. And so we want to build an environment where they thrive and they come to be in our soils. So the living component, it's a wonderful thing. We have this magical soil web, where we have a lot of eating going on. And so really all this to say is that, so we have the dead, that organic residue that we put in our soil, that can be consumed by the primary consumers. And then the primary consumers can be consumed by the secondary consumers. And then the secondary consumers can be consumed by the tertiary consumers. So we have a lot of organisms and there's a lot of eating. And with all this eating, there's a lot of waste. And with that waste comes the nutrients within our soils. And that's where the recycling comes from. So couple living organisms I want to highlight real quick. So fungi, they typically come down, or they come in and they start breaking down very hard material. So if you see mushrooms in your soil or mushrooms in your lawn, they're there breaking something down. They really prefer low soil disturbance. So that makes sense. If you're out there tilling or working in the soil, that can really bust up their network and makes it harder for them to do their job. And so they kind of come in and they sort of break down that harder material. So things like mulch or tree roots, and they soften it up so that other organisms can come in and eat those, eat what is left over. But they also play there's also another type of fungi that plays a crucial role in the soil, and that is the mycorrhizal fungi. And so this is a fungi that has a type of fungi that has a symbiotic relationship with plants. And so they essentially expand the root system. And so that picture there, that's a plant root with the hyphae of mycorrhizal fungi coming off of it. And so what happens is that the mycorrhizal fungi will expand the area in which the plant can take up nutrients and water. And then the plant will provide glucose and sugars produced through photosynthesis back to those mycorrhizal fungi. And so they've got that symbiotic relationship where they're helping each other out. So to visualize this, if you were to think of a plant that's just only has its roots, so that's the rhizosphere. But then to magnify that, we also have the mycorrhizal sphere, where the mycelial fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, expand that network and are able to pull up so much more from that soil. And then, of course, the other organism that we have in soil that we love and appreciate are the earthworms. And so I put this quote up here real quick. I'll read it. "The plow is one of the most ancient and most valuable of man's inventions, but long before he existed, the land was in fact regularly plowed and continues to thus be plowed by earthworms." And so it's a lovely visual of how the earthworms are working within the soil. They're plowing, they're kind of almost tilling the soil in a very soft, gentle way, breaking that soil up. And of course, all along the way, they are creating waste, which feeds our plants. And so if you want to encourage earthworms, they need a nice, well-aerated soil. It's easier for earthworms to move through a softer soil profile. Typically, they like a nice residue on top of the soil surface. And so leaving mulch or leaves or things like that on top of the soil can help with earthworms. They like a lot of humus in the soil. So that's that very dead organic matter. And they also, they don't really like it too much when you get in there and start messing with the soil. So you want to limit tillage because that can prevent their, that can break up their burrows and their networks and also bury some of their food supply. So any questions so far up to this point? I'm sorry about the red line. I can't figure out how to get rid of it. Okay, seeing none, I will keep going. So with the dead, so we talked about the living, but now we're going to move on to the dead. And so this is anything that has recently deceased and is typically the main food source for our organisms in the soil. And so essentially what happens is they munch on that, and that allows for the plants to be able to absorb those nutrients. And so essentially this is the logic behind using mulches as well as cover crops, which we'll talk about. And so necessarily too, if you're using, you want to use organic mulches when you're using mulches. That doesn't necessarily mean certified organic. And so if you're not growing organically and that's not a concern to you, I still recommend using organic mulches. It just means something that was alive at some point and is going to break down over time. And so that would be in contrast to using something like a weed barrier or rocks or rubber mulch. Those are all inorganic mulches. They're not going to break down. You want to use something that's going to break down. And so it's great when they break down because, again, that's that dead becoming the very dead and releasing nutrients into the soil. But of course, mulches have other benefits, particularly that they can help retain moisture so the soil doesn't dry out as quickly, as well as temperature so you don't have strong fluctuations, and controlling weeds. And so weed seeds may pop up, they're not able to absorb light, and then they die because they can't photosynthesize because there's a weed barrier, a mulch barrier there preventing the weeds. So a couple organic mulches that you can consider, peat moss, sawdust, lots of things. Of course, sometimes get the question, well, what's the best mulch to use? I am a huge advocate for use what you have. So if you have a big oak tree that's dropping tons and tons of leaves, you can use some of that, or pine straw if you have a leftover hay bale from a Halloween decoration, you can use that as well. And so these are some of the ones that will break down the fastest. And so particularly in a vegetable garden, they may be appropriate because you're moving plants in and out of that space fairly often, as opposed to something like a landscape bed where you may have established shrubs. Compost, typically in this context, we're going to consider this the very dead, but it still works as a great mulch. And then we have the wood chips, bark, wood shavings. These take a little bit longer to break down because they're a bit more of a tougher material. So they may be more appropriate in a landscape area where you don't want to constantly be adding in mulches every time you turn over turn over the bed. And of course, I'll also add, obviously, your the budget that you have for your garden plays into this as well as your aesthetic preferences. And so, if you're looking into, if you want your vegetable beds to have very nice looking mulch because maybe it's right outside your kitchen window, okay. It's up to your budget and your aesthetic preferences. I did see a question on how to use shredded paper in the garden. So you can use shredded paper. It's going to decompose very, very quickly, really with sort of the same kind of texture as maybe leaves or grass clippings. You wouldn't see it for very long. I'd probably recommend getting it wet before putting it into any garden. It can add some organic matter. But I think maybe if you are composting paper, it may be a better place to put paper in the compost bin, because I don't think you're really going to get a whole lot of benefit out of adding it necessarily to the garden. As you are, if you add it to the compost bin, then you're keeping it out of the landfill. So that's just my kind of 2 cents, but you could do what you want. So we've talked about mulches, and that's a great way to add some dead material to feed your organisms in the soil. But you can also cover crop. And so sometimes also referred to as green manure. So it's green plant waste, where you're growing something out, not necessarily because you plan to eat it or because you plan to look at it. Some of them are pretty, but that may not be the goal. That's not necessarily your goal. So you're growing it because it's going to improve that soil texture or that soil composition. And so you grow out these particular plants for a short period of time. You don't want them to get too mature, because if that starts to happen, then it's harder for them to break down. You want them to be fairly young. You mow them down and essentially work them back into the soil. And so that comment there about lignin, that's the tough compound in plants. And so you want them to be very low in lignin so that they can break down fairly quickly and get you a big boost of organic matter relatively quickly. Now, we talk a lot about cover cropping in the context of maybe like farming, or particularly market gardeners who are growing vegetables on a large scale, maybe selling at a farmer's market, but this can absolutely be done in a raised bed. So if you're putting your beds to winter, you could add a cover crop in around September, October that holds until February or March when you go to plant your cool season stuff. And so can absolutely be done on a small scale. And even still, if you're going to plant a garden in a new area and maybe you're not doing raised beds, starting with a cover crop is a great idea. So just a couple of the benefits of cover crops. Helps with that organic matter, helps with the mycorrhizal populations. You can pick legume cover crops that will add nitrogen back to your soil, or there are several grassy type cover crops that really help break up tough soil, or something like the tillage radish, which has a very thick root and helps break up soil. So you can add nitrogen or break up some of those really heavy soils. And even still, typically with soils, it is a best practice to never leave that soil uncovered. And so having a plant there gives you some coverage. If you don't have the opportunity to do a cover crop, at least cover your soils with mulch. If you want to, we could talk about cover crops for a long time, but I will add that if you want to learn a bit more about cover cropping, particularly differences in the different species and options, I would check out this OSU fact sheet on healthy garden soils by David Hillock. It is a fantastic fact sheet, and a lot of what we're talking about tonight is in this fact sheet, but it goes in more in-depthly into some of the species recommended for garden cover crops. So would absolutely recommend giving that a read if you want to learn more about cover crops. So moving on to the very dead, or humus, as it is sometimes referred to. I hear sometimes hummus, but that is something that I eat. And so I don't eat humus, I eat hummus. And so we're calling it humus tonight. It is essentially the very heavily decomposed material. So after the organisms, they munch on the very dead, they have their waste product, the nutrients are released. What's left over in that waste is the very dead and the humus. So it's no longer really a food for our soil organisms, but this is then where we're going to get into the muscle of the soil, where we see all the fantastic structural changes to soil. And so going back to our clay profile, our clay soil profile, where we have such a difficulty with water moving through this profile, when we have humus and we have that very dead organic matter, what happens is it sort of clumps the clay together, creating what are called aggregates. And so those aggregates form and open up the pore space in our clay soils, allowing for easier infiltration of water. In our sandy soils, we have, when we add an organic matter, we increase that surface area and we have better exchange of nutrients by increasing that surface area. So to finish tonight off, we will just do a little taster on composting. We'll admit this is kind of a quick breeze through composting. Composting could be its own class. And if that's something you want, please put that in the post assessment when I send that out tomorrow. But adding in compost is one of the easiest ways to add that very dead to your soil. So you're adding that material to helping that amendment with that structural through compost. It does have more, when you add in compost, you are adding a little bit more of a release of nutrients. That's compared to what's created by the organisms when they're actually in the soil through the process of mineralization. So you do have more nutrients added into that soil through compost. A couple things to keep in mind about compost, especially if you're buying bagged compost, they can sometimes be heavy in salts. So just make sure you know what it is that you're getting when you're purchasing compost. And if you're not sure, if you're like, okay, this was on sale, so I bought it, do what we call a bioassay, which is really where just try it in a small area and see if it's okay before adding it to the whole garden, because it's less sad to kill one plant as compared to the whole garden. So you can do a bioassay if you're not quite sure on how things are going to play out. So you can also make your own compost if you don't want to have to rely on bagged sources or buying sources. So several different ways to make compost, but the recipe is all the same. When you are making compost, you can use items such as yard waste, grass clippings, leaves, twigs, excess vegetation. All that can go in the compost bin or the compost pile. You can also use produce scraps. So if you're cooking in the kitchen, using things, like like your potato peels, or like the bottom of your romaine head when you're making a Caesar salad, or maybe you had the best intentions of meal prepping spinach smoothies and then you forgot about it and then the spinach went bad. That can be composted. So it's keeping these things out of the landfill, which is fantastic. You can also use newspaper or shredded paper, as we kind of already talked about. Chipped branches, coffee grounds, tea leaves, eggshells, all these items can be composted. Now there are a couple things you don't want to put in the compost pile. And so that's going to include any fatty products, particularly non-plant products. So meat, dairy bones, fish, don't put that in the compost bin. Bones, not a good idea. Also want to avoid synthetic products like plastics. And so on the topic of paper, if you're composting all your junk mail, make sure you're avoiding like anything that has that window that shows the address. Want to avoid that. Or glossy products, because that has like a plastic sheen on it, so you couldn't necessarily do magazines. So just avoid that. Diseased plants. Typically, if you're composting very strategically and scientifically, any diseases or weed seeds will break down to where they're no longer viable. But a lot of us don't have the time or energy to be that strategic and scientific about it. We have a pile in the backyard that we mix and we add water to. And so if that's, so it's really a best practice to avoid putting those things in the compost bin. And then please do not make yourself sick. Pet or human waste should stay well away from the compost bin. So I see a quick question in the chat. Is it better to make compost on the ground or get a compost compactor? And so if you're saying compost compactor, what I'm envisioning is like a turn bin or something kind of like that, keeping it off the ground. The bins are nice because it can help you turn them. But then the challenge is that it's harder to, once that bin is full, you then have to wait for it all to break down. And so really you could do either or. There's not one that's better than the other. It's more about your what your preferences are as far as spending money or how much you want to get into composting. I mean, some of the more serious composters will have a 3-bin system. And so that's composting at different stages. So one that's actively decomposing, one that you're adding to, one that you're pulling from for the garden. But I don't necessarily have room in my backyard for a 3-bin compost system. So I have just a plastic bin from the box store that I use. But you can also just do a pile in the backyard. It really doesn't necessarily matter. The key to having success, at least with sizing, is you want to make sure it's at least a 3 by 3 by 3 foot cubic spot that you're adding to, because then that allows it to heat up in the middle, and that's where the microbes do their thing and start to break down. So it needs to be at least that big in order for microbial composting to happen. So when making the recipe for your compost bin, we're adding what we call greens and browns. Browns are kind of like adding the carbon, whereas greens are more of the nitrogen, and that then feeds our microbes, and our microbes break that down. And so our microbes in the compost bin, they prefer a 3-to-1 brown to green ratio. And so here are just a few examples of what's brown and what's green. I won't necessarily read those off to you right now, but keep in mind, if a 3-to-1 brown to green ratio, that means we need to add a lot more of the brown. And with some of the troubleshooting with composting, what we see is that we've got too much green going on in there. So when you're making a compost bin, make sure that you are keeping up with your browns, adding in dried leaves, grass clippings, things like that. Dried grass clippings, excuse me. Grass clippings can be green. But just keep up with that and make sure. And then once you get that ratio right, you'll have good success with your composting. So using compost in the garden, you want to work that into the top 6 inches of the soil, but you can also use it as a mulch. Like I said, pay attention to the temperature, or if you're going to be very scientific about it, you want to monitor the temperature. That's making sure that the inside is getting hot, and with that, and that's breaking down everything in the compost bin. But if you're not monitoring the temperature, you want to just be careful about what you put in it, because weed seeds, diseases are not going to break down, and those could potentially be introduced back into the garden. You can also, if you're growing in containers, save a little bit of money and add in some compost with your potting soil. Because if you're filling up a large container, potting soil can get expensive. I do want to say, though, one thing about compost and adding compost to the garden. We love compost. It's a great way to keep items out of the landfill and helps the structure of our soil. But compost is a complete fertilizer. And so it typically has even amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Fairly in low amounts, but still amounts of across the board of the same of those macronutrients. And so if we're relying on compost as our only source of soil amendments and soil nutrients, we're going to build up phosphorus and potassium to very high levels over time. And so I've seen some vegetable garden soil tests that come back with very high phosphorus, and you start having the conversation. It's like, well, I've just been adding compost in that spot for 20 years. That's going to be a very nice, rich, soft, comfy soil, but that high level of phosphorus can then cause some issues. And so just be aware that there are other things that we want to put into our soils just besides compost. That compost isn't the only thing we want to necessarily add because of that phosphorus and potassium content building up over time. Okay, I see a question on speak to chicken litter in compost. So is that a question like, can I use it in compost, or how does it really break down in compost? You can absolutely compost chicken litter. It's a great, adding that in, I think it's a great source of brown. If you go to that fact sheet that I mentioned that has the cover crop information, it has specific fertilizer breakdowns for composts derived from different materials. And so if you have a compost and you're predominantly adding chicken litter to it and letting that break down, the actual numbers and amounts are in that fact sheet for chicken litter, cow manure, things like that. So if you want some more specific amounts as far as nutrients, that would be a place to check. So to wrap up, I hope that after this evening, you realize that soil is more than just dirt, something that we get on ourselves while we're gardening, and that you can get a soil test to know the exact amount of nutrients needed so that you're not over or under applying, you're not spending too much money, and you're not adding in extra nutrients into the environment. And that if you have problematic soils and want to take care of your soil, or just take care of your soil, build that organic matter up. It's going to help with drainage. It's going to help with fertility. And it's also going to help support all of the lovely, magical, beneficial organisms that we have in the soil that make it the living matrix that it is. Just a couple resources. Well, really just one. I'm an extension educator, so I'm going to turn you to the extension fact sheet website. I already mentioned it a couple times. That's the website. If you want more specific information on composting or soil health or any other gardening topic, go there, put it in the search bar, and it'll pull up any OSU publication on that topic. And so with that, I've got 6:34. I apologize. I went a little bit over tonight, but this is a fun and important topic. So I'll take whatever questions that you have. I see Darlene asked, how do you monitor the temperature and compost? So you do have to get a compost thermometer, and it's basically like a meat thermometer, except with a really, really long probe. So you can stick it in there. And then Vaughn asked about recording. I will do my best to get this out tomorrow morning. If not tomorrow morning, at least sometime tomorrow. So you can catch the beginning of the class or rewatch it. Any other questions? if you have lingering questions, or something pops up in your brain in the middle of the night, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer.
You did
What
have
is the best organic matter? Great question. What is the best organic matter to add to soil, but would still limit up building that P and K? So that's where you want to consider the cover cropping. That's really going to help with that. Maybe doing like a legume cover crop to add in some nitrogen. Also going back to those organic fertilizers, like the blood meal and the fish emulsion. I will say that can get very pricey on a large scale. But if you have a backyard garden, definitely an option to get that nitrogen content up without having to, including as much phosphorus and potassium. Still has a little, but it's got more nitrogen, so it's better. Okay. Well, seeing no more questions, I am going to stop the recording, and I hope that you all will join us. So the next 2 sessions are really focused on veggies. So if veggies aren't your thing, I hope you'll join us in a couple weeks. But if veggies are your thing, that is all next week and the following week. And I hope you'll, even if you're not a veggie person, I hope you'll join us. So hope to see everybody next week.